Thank you, everyone, and also thank you for the organizers for the invitation. It's really lovely to be here and have these opportunities for exchange, also with, now, of course, great papers that came before. I mean, I hope to be able to add a little bit on top of that. So what I'm going to talk about is also some look at infant, in particular, infant and prenatal death in medieval and early modern European context. So there might be some redundancy to what Eileen has said, but in a way, I think it's nice in a way, to coupling our presentations, because I think I will try to flip the coin a little bit. Now we have seen very closely about how emotions and our reflections on emotions can probably also help us better look at practices in the past. And what I'm going to try to do is if we try to look at practices in the past, maybe they can help us to reflect on our own society today. So kind of a reverse try. In my paper, I will focus on historical responses to child deaths through burial archaeology and mainly patterns. I'm afraid the bioarchaeologists might be a little bit disappointed, but there will be a lot of other pictures. And I will focus in particular on the question of the burial of unbaptized children in the medieval and early modern periods by setting practices traceable in the archaeological record against burial regulations of the Catholic Church. And then I will try to see how such practices cannot be only seen in terms of response and grief and emotions, but also like as a more complex reaction to social conflict at a different level, and how this probably can help us also to reflect on our society today. Now, if you call it death at the beginning of life, and with this I really mean death in context of pregnancy or birth, we see when we look at it archaeologically or anthropologically that it poses a particularly critical situation in almost any society. So the cultural specifics of how societies approach this problem might be very different, but we see actually very often that when babies die or babies are stillborn, that there are different modes coming into action of how to deal with this situation. And anthropologists say that this has to do a lot about very fundamental questions we all ask ourselves, but also our communities, about the constitution of the world and life. Personhood and identity, what makes us human, but also what makes us into a person, what makes us into a member of a group. How will lineages, kinships, or future prospects of a community, for example, continue if the hope of new life is not fulfilled? And of course, then the question, how will those who never really lived actually will be integrated into these worldviews? And I think this is really just very placative to say that there are very different engagements in different time periods where we can see that very small children, babies, are usually treated in probably different ways than you would see for the large majority of society. We see this in the Paleolithic. We have seen a lot of Roman examples today, and we will see a lot of the medieval stuff now again. But this continues until today. So you also see here examples from modern periods, so from Indonesia as well as from the United States, where we see this particular group of dead kind of poses a particular problem for society, both for the parents but also for communities at large. And I want to look at this now a little bit more in specific on the example of how this evolved in the medieval period and early modern periods. And Eileen has said a lot about this. I just want to expand a little bit. So if we talk about afterlife and who is not to be included in Christian thought, we also need to look into the beginning of life in Christian medieval thought, asking like, when actually in Christian doctrine or Christian worldviews does a person actually become a person? And I'm not saying about a Christian, but a person, because there has been a lot of writings also in medieval theology about really the ensoulment of the fetal body in the female womb, which is the moment when actually the pure flesh turns into a human being, a person, not a Christian. That's important. And there are really fantastic depictions of that. So people in that period really imagined that very physically, like with small souls being inserted into female pregnant bodies, really like ensouling the small bodies, which their mother feels then with the quickening of the fetus. And what I find very interesting, that there are few, but there are medieval writings on about, for example, the problem or how the attitude of abortion. And what I found particularly interesting is that what you see, that abortion, of course, is always considered a grave sin, but it's not considered murder if the quickening of the fetus hasn't occurred. And this is like things that are not too far off when we talk about today about abortion and like limits or not, or when is a fetus a person, a human or not. Although being animated through the divine spirit, the unborn was still considered to be a person with a corrupted soul, and that's the whole problem, burdened with the inheritance of original sin. So a condition that only baptism, of course, could cleanse and then turn a person into a true Christian. And this is now where the problem, like with the afterlife, comes in, as we heard before by Eileen. Only true and faithful Christians, meaning people who had been baptized, were considered as part of the Christian community, as free of original sin, and therefore could actually hope for salvation and resurrection on Judgment Day. The highest aspiration of Christian thought. And this is something, I mean, it's not like the same idea all over medieval period. There's a kind of evolvement and a more abstract idea about this to something very concrete in the late medieval period, up to the point where in medieval art we see a lot of depictions how the afterlife is considered to be, and where people, depending on where they are situated in relation to Christian community, basically end up in the afterlife. So good, true Christians, they will eventually, after purification in purgatory, that's what you will see here, have the chance on Judgment Day to basically be cleansed of their sins and enter heaven and see God, whereas those who have gravely sinned or haven't been part of the community, unfortunately, will be condemned forever. That's what we see usually on the right side of such doomsday pictures. But then there's also a very rare depiction here of the unbaptized children. So children who have not been baptized but born to Christian parents, but yet they can't be considered part of this community. And that's one of these evolvements we have seen. Augustine still talks about these children of being sent to hell in the 4th century, 5th century, whereas in the higher and late Middle Ages, this turns into a more mild approach by the church, saying, well, they will go to limbo, it's kind of a cornerstone of hell, it's not that bad, they won't suffer, but unfortunately they will still be there forever. So that's basically the image of the world that is being transferred by Catholic teachings into the broader population. And something that you hear in sermons, I gave you one quote here of Berthold from Regensburg, you see it in imagery, so there's a very strong communication from the, let's call it religious experts, towards the broad population who are being taught of how this world is going to work. Now the problem with all of this is also that this theological master plan in the metaphysic world also was then transferred into the physical work, for example, by burial regulations. That were introduced in the 12th and 13th century that really prescribed the exclusion of also unbaptized children from consecrated ground, meaning from a proper Christian cemetery. And what is interesting here is in a way that these directives that we can see are very much to make sure that the cemetery is not polluted in a way, so it's like a counterplan of keeping the Christian community poor. But in a way, it's also really a mean of controlling their own Christian community, to really force them that they should take care that children are being baptized, that they are being emergency baptized if necessary. And it's a way of the church not so much only to care for their community, but also to consolidate their power. And that's, I think, is something very important to think about, because it goes, we have heard it in the first talk, very much together also on how female bodies are basically seen in that period, how they are put under certain regimes, in particular pregnant female bodies. There is a lot of ideas in theologicals of how pregnant women, when they die, how they might pollute also the cemetery and so on. And on the other hand, we also know that women in that time period who are also involved in the care for pregnant women or during the birth process, that they are really also in danger of being persecuted by authorities if they do not properly administer, for example, emergency baptisms. We have a lot of court records where we see persecutions of midwives who are being accused of not having done their job, of having been sorcerers and so on. So there is really a very strong control regime over this nexus of mothers and children in that period. And I would say that also these burial regulations have to be seen in this context. Now, when we look at many, many examples of medieval Christian cemeteries, I say in Central Europe, but of course it also applies to many parts of Western Europe and Northern Europe, a little bit later probably, we can see that these enforcements of these teachings and also this exclusion of the unborn children, the unbaptized children from the cemetery is something that is more or less to a large majority adhered to. And we see this by the uniformity in the archaeological record of the archaeological pattern. So if you have medieval parish cemeteries, they very often look basically like this, that you have cemeteries where you have like single inhumation graves, usually without any grave screws, so this idea of like the pious Christian. They are, as we have heard, usually west-east oriented, so this is not doctrinal, but there is like a kind of idea behind it that Christ will rise on Judgment Day in the east, so and if people also bodily resurrect, it's better that they resurrect into the right direction, right? So it's a very, very practical way actually of how to bury people. And it's really this single unfurnished inhumation rite that's very, very systematic. Here you can see one example how this might look like, or here an aerial image from one of the excavations in Switzerland from the Kantonsarchäologie in Bern, who did a lot of excavations in the 1980s and 70s. However, what we can also observe in the archaeological record across Central Europe and other parts as well are burials of fetuses, perinates, and neonates in particular. So that's the most likely age group representing unbaptized children, which divert from this normative burial rite. And I just want to go with you now through a few examples to show you what I mean. So we have, yes, examples like this, where basically infants or also prematurely born babies, probably stillborn babies, are buried in regular cemeteries, so they're supposed to be excluded, but in the grave of adults. And we have this is an example now, a rather novel one from a really very long excavation of a medieval and early modern not actually early modern, I think it's 18th century, I believe, it stops in St. Pölten, right? A cemetery in Austria that was excavated over the last 10, 15 years or so, and 20,300 or 23,000 burials being excavated, so really a large sample. And here we can see that children up to the age of 3 months, but also a lot of fetuses, they're more or less scattered across the parish cemetery or the dome cemetery, but they usually more often not come in their own graves, they come like as by given burials in burials of adults, and it is most likely there hasn't been an ADN analysis yet, but there is age and sex determination, and it shows that we have these children in adult graves of males, of old women, of very young women. So there seems to be a crisscross, and it's not this like mother-child combination. Rather, it looks like these babies have been maybe illicitly been put into a grave of a person who died at the same time period, simply to provide them a grave, although they shouldn't have. So some of these illicit practices. What's interesting, if you talk to people from the Vienna burial services, the older employees, they will tell you that this has been practiced in Vienna with the municipal cemetery until the 1950s. To, for example, bury miscarriages, so to speak, in law, I will come to that later, that were not by law to be buried, that they would still put them illegally in some kind of coffin to give them a proper Christian or a proper burial at least. And then we have a phenomenon which also is very interesting, that we in several different constellations see that often burials of infants and perinates are clustering in normal or in regular parish cemeteries, either close to the church walls, sometimes inside the churches, which also would have been actually, or should have been forbidden in that period according to doctrine, sometimes close to other parts of the church walls. But there is a clustering available, and we often see that it occurs like here in Waldkringen in Switzerland. These babies are buried in random orientation. So this is not the west-east that you would have regularly. They're often crossing each other, although it seems stratigraphically that they occur in a rather short period of time, which is an indication that this is a burial rite that is not administered by a religious profession, meaning a priest, but this is something rather being done by families, probably unauthorized and outside the regular framework that the church would actually be providing. We also have examples like this where we find clusters of small babies and stillborn children, probably in liminal places of medieval cemeteries, for example, in corners close to the cemetery walls, like here in Münsterhof Parish Cemetery in Zurich. Again, with rather random orientations, as you can see, and probably not too far off from the Chilin. We do also have in some parts of Central Europe burial grounds, particularly for early deceased children, like here in Göttweg, but there is also close by in Gossam or in Michelberg in Lower Austria, where you have sites where basically cemeteries where fetuses, perinates, neonates are buried, next to secluded churches that didn't have any burial privilege. So not parish churches, but rather secluded churches, or already like vacated chapels in the context of castle buildings or stuff like that. And then as a last example, I want to show you this also well-documented practice in written sources, the pilgrimage with dead-born children to revival centers, sanctuaires à répit, they call it in French. So pilgrimage centers where parents basically could bring their stillborn babies or their unbaptized children to these shrines where then clergymen or nuns would do some miraculous ritual where sometimes they involve feathers and coals, and then the babies are miraculously revived for a second and baptized, and then they can be buried properly. This, of course, is not authorized by the official church. In the case of Oberbüren, which you see here, which is probably one of the best documented of these pilgrimage centers, although there have been a lot in Switzerland, in France, in northern Italy, in Austria, and so on. But here we have also a very interesting correspondence of the Bishop of Constance, who was responsible for that place in the 15th century. And he complains to the Vatican that he had to fine already 2,000 women in the last 2 years who, against his ruling, would take their dead babies to this shrine. And there were these resistant priests there. They wouldn't listen to him and keep on with this superstition of like baptizing the dead babies and what he should do. So we see that there is a tension growing basically between officials of the church and what's happening in local communities. Now it's interesting here in Oberbüren, so it's a pilgrimage center, and you have a regular cemetery outside. What they found also during the excavations, we have a lot of records that dead babies were retroactively baptized there, that we have a lot of these pits, which you can see here down. Sorry, I have to put on the laser pointer. I see I didn't do that, sorry. This one here, where you can see that there have been several pits around the church where you find this really then tiny bones and remains of fetuses and neonates. And there is the question if maybe pilgrimage was not a random thing where people would just come, maybe there were fixed dates during the year, and then they would also bury the children in the same pits. That's one of the ideas what we see here in the archaeology. Interesting to know this kind of rite continued, for example, in some parts of the Alps until the 18th or 19th century. So that's something really with a long continuation. Now, if you look into most academic literature, I mean, there are lots of these sites and super interesting. There's very little interregional comparisons, though, and what we see a lot is that I would call it non-normative infant graves in the medieval period are often, of course, interpreted in a way that it is an emotional response of parents basically disobeying the church because they feel they need to do something for their children to save them in the afterlife. That's basically the idea behind this. And I totally agree. I think that's probably one of the most emotive things you can do. However, I would say it's not only about medieval people's profound faith or folk beliefs and the hope for post-mortem faiths. I think what we see here is something a little bit more complex in terms of social conflict. I argue that special treatment, like we see this, and these are not single cases, we see it comes reoccurringly, also embodies a genuine subversive practices where families deliberately choose to disobey ecclesiastic authorities and undermine official directives, and it becomes something repetitive across Europe. And we see also that in the late medieval period, this is becoming stronger. So there's not so much like going that on in the 12th century, but it comes more and more over the 13th, 14th, and then 15th century. Now, I said in the beginning there are these insecurities about the ontological status basically of infants because they are in this liminal stage when they die in the context of pregnancy, of birth. And although this is biculturally, of course, very specific, I think it's not only about bereavement and grief and doubts that we see in the parents, but that there is also a social conflict when you have a society with different parts and an asymmetric power structure where one group who is in power basically tries to determine on how to approach this problem with exclusion, with burial regulations, and tries to put their views basically on all the needs and probably aspirations of the other people. Now, subversive burial practices that we see in the archaeological record have to be considered in that sense also as a response to both severe spiritual, probably psychological crisis of parents, also of course with the question for the fate of the dead child, what will happen with the family and so on, and probably simply emotions of sorrow and sadness. but also in face of roaring infant mortality in the late medieval period and the growing discontent with the church, I think what we see here is more complex. In the late medieval period, we have soaring mortality rates also among children due to multiple health crises, like the pandemics of the Black Death in the 14th century. We have several famines and very cold winters because of the Little Ice Age and so on, so where death rates really go up. So people experience more and more often that death is coming basically to their homes, and at the same time the discontent with the church through their authoritative behavior, we notice indulgence traits and so on that we see in the late medieval period, is getting stronger. And so I think that what we see here in particular, this growing amount of deviant burial practices in the late medieval period, is a kind of one part of a larger negotiation process or protest actually coming out of lay population to contest the church authority as a kind of intersectional crisis. We have accumulation in health crisis, we have accumulation generally with the authoritarian behavior of the church, and then we have of course this parental grief, and it comes together in what makes this probably a multi or intersectional crisis. And I think what's important here to notice that this is not something, well, just I'm telling or so on. There's a lot of theoretical studies on what crisis is actually constituted by. When do people feel that they are in crisis? And we can have this as a psychological effect. We can have economic and whatever. You can see what crisis we are in today, yeah? But the point is always, do people feel on their basic level, on their like daily lives, do they feel threatened in a way of their identities, or when they look to the future and think about the continuation of their social existence? And that means what we see here, like this personal grief and the loss of the child, may be very intimate, but it's also bound in a bigger structure of fear and of asymmetric power structures that kind of determine and how people are allowed to act or what they could not do. And in this sense, I think what we see here, it might be emotive, it might be very emotional, but I think it's also a very good way of what sociologists will call everyday resistance in burial practice against these rulings of the church. Now, what's interesting to see is that maybe you want to consider this, or I want to consider this one part of like many tiny actions that actually allowed reformers then in the 15th and 16th century to really contest the Catholic Church and really unite what we know now today as the Reformation, so a lot of change. But that had to be fueled and underlined with support, of course, from a broad populations. Otherwise, this would not have happened. And I think when we look at practices like this is all these tiny bits that come together and make it possible in the 16th century for reformed ideologies to actually hit ground. Now, that doesn't mean, and that's the problem with crisis, that they always lead to something better. They sometimes do, but not always. And what I find very interesting is when you look now at what happens during, or for example, then in the modern period after the Reformation, is that there is really a diversion in how early deceased children and unbaptized children seem to be treated in Catholic areas in Central Europe and in Reformed ones. On the left side, you have an example from East Tyrol, St. Justina, where you have baby burials outside. So that's it's a very steep location. It's in the Alps, so that is the outside of the cemetery. The cemetery extends here. And basically on the outside of the cemetery wall, you have inhumation graves of also 2 perinates and 1 fetus that in 16th to 7th century, because of some finds that come with that, graves are dated at the moment. So you have a continuation of these exclusionary mechanisms. Or you have, like Eileen said before, in Ireland, that you see also in context of the Counter-Reformation that new forms of exclusion are being founded for that region. But the point is there is a continuation and a reinforcement of the church, of their teachings. We also see this then in the modern period by writings that really say we need to kind of be harder to families to really not do anything and try to keep or really like look after the babies that they are being baptized. So there is a stronger regime coming. Now what's interesting is when you look to reformed areas, there seems to be a switch in that. We know that both Calvin and Luther and many reformers, actually one of the very basic theological counter readings they did was the necessity of baptism for resurrection. They said, well, actually that's not necessary. I mean, if there's love by the parents, the children are included, even if they're not baptized. If they are, it would be nice, but if not, it's also okay. And what they do is they lift the burial regulations. So there are no bans of unbaptized babies in reformed areas. For example, in Switzerland, it's totally legal and okay to bury them. Yet what it's interesting to see, this is, I think, an example many people know because it has been cited quite a lot in literature. It's from Egarten in Switzerland, a reformed cemetery. The famous Iftrip burials of the modern period are found, where you can see in this, like where I marked in red here, whole lines of neonates and perinates and fetuses are buried in perfect line, but under the eaves of the church here in Egarten. And this is, as we know from folk beliefs, really connected to this idea that rainwater will drip basically from the rooftop and retroactively baptize. But when we look at folk tradition, this is really something coming from reformed areas, and we also see that it's very regular in opposition to what we see in the medieval period. It's probably something administered. We see this in some of the folk studies in that period. The priest won't disagree. Parents can do this. There is no like illicit or illicit component to this, and it becomes very, very regular. Now, looking at this and this kind of intersectional crisis and like the clash basically that you have between views and the aspiration of parents with what authority in that point the church is telling them, is something which I think we can take as a point of departure to think how today we deal, or our society handles, the death of very small children during pregnancy or shortly after birth. And I think it's worth really combining like a little bit more the social complexity from the past with what's going on for today. So, of course, we know that since the 19th century and the medical innovations we had with vaccines and penicillin and more hygiene in medical care also for pregnant women and during birth, that we have reached globally a historic low on infant mortality. That's fair to say. Nevertheless, we can also see that also in Western societies where this has become very rare, pre- and perinatal death remains a very conflicting but also very tabooed issue, because it's often also seen with regimes over female bodies and the question of abortion laws, for example. Now, what's interesting is that psychological studies concerning parental grief over pre- and perinatal death in modern Western society have found that it is, of course, in a way, the psychological crisis through the loss of a child and the personal bereavement that's problematic, but what also leads to depression and large problems is when parents realize that the concept they have about their children's personhood and identity does not fit with legal definitions of the state. So a person in status civil law or institution in handling of miscarriages in our modern society. And I want to bring you here an example from the Bundesgesetzblatt, so that's Austrian legislation, where you can see the definition of actually what makes a person these days. And it resembles a little bit what you see in many European legal contexts, where the recognition of babies as persons depends on either vital signs at birth, or for stillborn children on a birth weight of at least 500 grams or a gestational age of 24 weeks. Any other stillborn babies are qualified legally as miscarriages and are not entered into the civil registry, meaning that the state does not recognize them as persons, but parents very much feel about that. And this bureaucratic negation not only metaphorically conflicts with parents' notions of their deceased children's identities, it also has very legal consequences for funerary rites. Remains of so-called miscarriages have been in many countries, are today, like in the United States, treated as biohazard materials and are not falling under burial regulations and are sometimes even treated as medical waste. In some German states, this has changed only in the last 10 years. So in Central Europe and in most European states, there has been a lot, like legally been adapting, at least to offer parents the opportunity to bury, or at least to say we cannot, even if it's like a miscarriage in a very early stage, not just simply put these tissues then in medical waste, but this is all possibly, or would have been possibly, human life, so we should bury it properly. And I would argue that these power structures bear actually quite much resemblance with what we see in the medieval period. It may no longer be the church that defines the parameters for granting children acceptance into the community through baptism, but it is the state operating on bureaucratic and rationalistic consideration that decides the legal existence of a person on the basis of weight or vital signs. And also legally, there is still, I think, a long way to go. What I think is very interesting, what we see across Europe in recent years, is that there is a social need and a psychological need for parents to come out of that taboo zone. And we see that a lot in Central Europe through the formation of such collective graves in regular cemeteries where parents have the opportunities to bury also fetal remains of very early pregnancy loss in communal cemeteries in collective graves, or where hospitals are doing this when they, for example, conduct abortions and the parents don't feel in a position where they want to handle this themselves. So with this, I simply want to stop to say maybe it's also like a two-way thing. We could think about how our emotions today can help us understand the past, but maybe it's also the past that can help us sort of reflect a little bit on how we deal with pregnancy loss and stillborn and early disease children today.